Hey, this is Troy Taylor with the Championship Football Coaches Clinic Podcast, sponsored by Reps VR, First Down Playbook, Rack Coach, The Top Hopper, Sideline Design, Sports Workbook, Tip of the Spear. And today we have Coach Brandon Thorn on, and he was recommended by our great friend, Bill Best, the offensive line coach at Colorado State. So, Brandon, for anybody that's watching today or will watch in the future on YouTube, tell us a little bit about yourself, Coach, and where you're from.
Yeah, so right now I live in San Antonio, Texas. I was born in Colorado, but raised in Florida. So I went to high school in Florida and everything, and then joined the military out of high school, and I was in the Air Force for 10 years.
Thank you for your service.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. But yeah, so I was a football fan my whole life, though, just diehard football fan, specifically NFL. Grew up a Broncos fan, but just became a fan of the whole NFL pretty early on. Started learning the rosters at a very young age, and just always kind of had a dream of like building a team and being a part of that process from like the scouting side of it. So that kind of just stuck with me my whole life. And then even throughout the military, it just continued to grow. Eventually I had an opportunity to leave the military early because they were downsizing at the time. This was like 2013 timeframe. And I figured, man, if I'm going to do this and pursue football, I got to do it now. So I recently met my wife at the time, just got married, still had no kids. So I was like, all right, let's do it. So I got out with the intent of trying to become an NFL scout. That was my dream, to get into the NFL and get into the team building sphere. So, man, I basically started from scratch. I was writing for some websites for free while I was in the military, doing like big boards and scouting reports and stuff. Didn't really know too much of what I was doing, but I had a passion for it. So I had actually went to the Senior Bowl in 2009. I took leave. I was stationed in Warner Robins, Georgia, and I took leave to just drive over to Mobile as a part of this tiny little website. So I got credentialed for that in 2009, and that was really cool. And that kind of gave me a taste of what it would be like to be in that environment, getting to see Bill Belichick there and Jerry Jones and, meeting John Elway and all this cool stuff. So fast forward a few years, 2013-ish, I got out, and, immediately upon getting out, I joined social media. I went on Twitter and everything, and I started to see, man, like, all right, like what's out here, like what are guys talking about? And I realized like nobody was really talking about line play, like offensive and defensive line. So I was like, okay, maybe there's an opportunity here to, at least get my footing and put out some content, with the offensive and defensive line, because I really liked those. I played offensive line in high school at least, so I at least had some sense of, what it was like. And and then quickly I stumbled upon an account of Ted Sundquist, who is a former general manager of the Broncos and also an Air Force veteran. So yeah, and he was living in Colorado Springs, where I had gotten out of the military. So there was a lot of things that lined up right there. I reached out to him, and he quickly responded. And he had a website that he was running with no real content on it aside from his stuff. So I was like, hey, can I just like create like a scouting department on your website and just like write for free? And he's like, yeah, sure. And then in the process of that, we started a podcast together, me and him, and we had all these guests on, from his time in the NFL. So I was getting all this inside info, and based on like how the NFL worked, and he was teaching me about scouting and what to look for. And I just kept meeting people. And then I stumbled upon the Scouting Academy, who was run by Dan Hatman, former NFL scout. And they basically teach you how to watch film, take notes, and then transcribe that into a report in a concise, descriptive manner. And it's taught by all former NFL coaches and scouts. So I did that. So I did the Scouting Academy, did the thing with Ted, and and I figured while I was online too, the offensive line thing, I wanted to dig into that. So we had a podcast guest on one time, LaCharles Bentley, former NFL offensive lineman. He was training guys out of Arizona, and this was 2015-ish time. So I was like, he was having a clinic. I went down there. This is all just kind of on my own dime, just investing in myself, my career. So I went down there. He invited me. So I went down there and just kind of took notes and just, immersed myself in it. And then I met a guy named Duke Manyweather who trains offensive linemen now. Me and him kind of connected, and I picked his brain, and I just started to learn through all these different resources about football, about how to basically watch film, take notes, and then also transcribe that to be able to describe it. Because a lot of people can watch it and, like former players can watch it and understand it, but they can't really describe it a lot. It's not very natural to like describe it. It's kind of an innate thing. So I really wanted to figure out how I can describe what I was seeing very well. And I just worked at that for years. And, it just kept building. And I was going to school with the GI Bill at the time and, finished my degree. And I worked for free for probably 3-4 years. Eventually started getting some paid stuff. And then I interviewed with the New York Jets in 2016.
Nice.
Yeah, great experience to go out there. I was one of the finalists, didn't get picked, but it was still really cool experience. And then like, man, I kind of vacillated back and forth. Like, because I needed to start making money too, because we had our first kid at the time. We have 3 now. And I was like, man, it's getting close to that time. Like, can I keep doing this or not? And then I had kind of a break where I started my own website through Substack. And I just put out a lot of content there. It's subscription based, and that really kept me in it. And then Bleacher Report, they offered me some stuff that I still work for. I do stuff for them. And then things kept coming together. And now here I am full time doing scouting, evaluation, primarily on offensive and defensive line. And I've been full time for about 3-4 years now. I've been going to Offensive Line Masterminds, which is on my shirt. It's an offensive line summit. I've been doing that for 6 years. I started on the ground floor with that with Duke. So that's been an incredible piece of my career as well. And it's all offensive line based, which is cool. And I'm making a living on it. My wife's staying home now, and we got 3 little kids, and I'm watching football, writing reports, and it's all offensive line based. So it's cool, man. It's been quite a journey, but here I am. So
yes, it's awesome because, I have some young guys that work with Totem Pole Nation. That's the YouTube channel that the podcast goes out on, and they're young and they're getting into it, and they're trying to feel their way out into, are they going to be recruiting guys? Are they going to be analysts? But they're young and they're passionate. They already have podcasts. So what advice could you give those young guys out there that might be 25 or in college that love football, might not have played it in college, and, want to have, a role in this business? What advice would you give those guys?
Yeah, man, it's a good question. I think some of the kind of obvious things that are simple but not very easy are some of the best answers, in terms of like perseverance, just sticking with it, trying to be resourceful and also humble, reach out, to experts in the field that are doing things that you want to do. And, try to provide value to them as well in the process, if you can. But yeah, you obviously you want to pick those people's brains of people who know more than you in the specific area that you are trying to work in, and just try to learn, try to be well-rounded in whatever, you try to also, I think, find a niche, as well, something that you are most passionate about, that maybe there's some hidden value there, or an opportunity where not a lot of people are in that field already. Try to find that thing, that unique approach that is unique to you. I think that would be very important as well. Because, I think over the last few years, especially, this space is getting a little crowded and you need to try to stand out in some way. So for me, that's been the trenches, offensive, defensive line, specifically offensive line, but both sides. But if there's a specific position, maybe, I would really lean into that and then find the experts in that position, former players, coaches, scouts, whatever, and just, I would kind of take that approach though, and take that angle on it, because it's worked out for me for one. And I think it's kind of an underutilized approach as well. It's tough to be a kind of jack of all trades, master of none. You can do that. Some guys have success with that. But it's just, I think, a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, I coach Morgan Moses. It starts for the Ravens, and I coach Brandon Ross,
Virginia,
scout for the Green Bay Packers. He's a DB scout.
Okay,
and it's pretty cool. Talking to Brandon, he told me that all they do is study DBs, and they study the greatest of all time, and Deion Sanders and Rod Woodson and Charles Woodson, and you doing offensive line. Today we want to talk about the current trends in the offensive line play. My claim to fame is that I got Jim McNally onto Twitter, and that took an hour.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And do you follow Coach McNally? And like he's like the ultimate lifelong learner. He's not married to one thing. He's always trying to learn and get better. So from being a young guy and having trench warfare, is there anything you picked up from Coach McNally?
Yeah, I mean, more so like nuance specific stuff. I love how he talks about playing long with offensive linemen, and it just resonated with me because it makes a lot of sense. And I have had conversations over the years with Scott Peters as well. Brown's assistant offensive line coach. When I first started my website, actually, I was able to reach out to him because I wrote something on Wyatt Teller in 2020.
From Virginia.
Yeah, Virginia Tech. And, I wrote something on Teller, and I picked, Coach Peters' brain on Teller and on specific plays that I cut up. And he kind of, gave me a little bit of his terminology as well. And I know that Coach McNally has been influenced by Coach Callahan and Coach Peters. And so some of their lingo and like the way that because, as as coaches, like there's a million different ways to say the same thing. But sometimes, hearing a different vernacular of something, it clicks finally. And some of the type of stuff that Coach McNally talks about with playing long specifically, that just has resonated with me. And it's so transferable and translatable to the film. It's very easy to see. And when you watch him show it on film, it's like, oh yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense in terms of creating leverage on guys and, playing with more control. And that's kind of a way to do it, in a way to describe it. So, but yeah, I have noticed that as well with him, to be at this point of his life, and still learning and adapting is inspiring, as well as his pull-ups, that's also pretty cool, for him, busting out pull-ups at his age is pretty cool. And I mean, he coached Jason Peters in Buffalo, and, Jason Peters, man, I mean, that's a guy I grew up like, watching, but in 2014, when I really dug into this, I was studying Jason Peters as much, if not more than anybody. So I have a lot of kind of reverence for Jason Peters and the way he played the game. And I've heard a lot of stories over the years from Lane Johnson and Brandon Brooks and all these Eagles guys who have been at offensive line masterminds about Jason Peters. So the fact that he was the coach that helped him transition from tight end to offensive line, and now he's going to be a Hall of Famer. Coach McNally's coached a lot of legends, but that one really stands out to me. Whenever I think of him, I think of Jason Peters. So
you mentioned the Eagles, and everybody always wants to talk about the Eagles offensive line.
Yeah.
And what is so great about them, Brandon, from when you've studied them?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you got to start with their two best players, Jason Kelce and Lane Johnson, and that's really where it starts, at least the last few years. I mean, prior, they had Jason Peters and Lane Johnson and Jason Kelce, and they had Brandon Brooks. That was like 2017. That line was incredible as well, as good, if not better. I think probably better than the line they have now, just because they had, Peters instead of Mailata. Kelce was younger, and then they had Brandon Brooks, who was, kind of like Landon Dickerson now. So, yeah, I mean, the common thread throughout that is Jeff Stoutland, their offensive line coach. So I think, what makes them special is, starts kind of at the top with their talent acquisition and Howie Roseman and their scouting department, but also Coach Stoutland, kind of guiding that room getting the most out of guys, pretty much every year. Going back to Kelsey getting drafted in the 6th round and Coach Stoutland saying, what was the first or second practice, like, this is our guy. I mean,
what did he see in him? Because I told my 7th grade son, like, someone could be a half height or half size, but it's something that's inside of them that is special. Like, what did Coach Stoutland say? What was it about Kelsey? Or was it just like Belichick said, if I was so smart, I would have drafted Tom Brady in the 1st round?
I think there's an element of that as well, where, I mean, they drafted him, but they still kind of like missed in a way, I mean, as did all, 32 teams. But yeah, I think it definitely was something, an intangible that Kelsey brought, kind of a relentlessness. But also there was kind of a base there physically to develop, power through leverage, which I think Kelsey has been a master at, throughout his entire career. Just the leverage he plays with, and then also the athletic ability, that athletic base. And there was a lot to develop there with that. And they've built the scheme around him, which, is tremendous. I think more players that don't have all the ideal physical traits would have been able to succeed if the coaching staff adapted better to the player, like they did with Kelsey, in terms of not always, but a lot of the time providing him guard help and pass protection, surrounding him with bigger guards, which they traditionally at least have had one, Brandon Brooks, Landon Dickerson, and then Pryor as well. So having the tackles to play on an island so the guards can consistently help the center, that's been a part of it. Getting him out in space in the run game a lot to maximize his skill set, because that's what Kelsey does better than anything, is get out in space, pulling, wrapping, leading at the 2nd and 3rd levels. So they're putting him in positions to succeed, to accentuate his strengths and mitigate his weaknesses. And then Kelsey is also special in a lot of ways. And then Coach Stoutland. So that's one piece of why their offensive line is special. And then Lane Johnson he's a Hall of Fame right tackle, the best right tackle in the league. And he has been the best right tackle for several years. So, in the NFL, there's a way where you can kind of get caught up in the scheme and things like that. And, focusing a lot on that, which definitely that is a huge part of it. But sometimes it just comes down to, like, they say Jimmy and Joe's instead of X's and O's. Like, they got Lane Johnson, they got Jason Kelsey. They have one of the strongest left guards in football, Landon Dickerson, who was a monster in college. And then Jordan Mailata. I mean, they got this guy. That's probably their most miraculous thing that they've done, that Jeff Stoutland has done, is develop Jordan Mailata, who never played football prior to getting to the NFL as a rugby player in Australia. Developing him into a quality left tackle is just that's one of Jeff Stoutland's, main, like, biggest accomplishments in his career. If you're talking about individual player development, if not the biggest, him and Kelsey, so, like, they extract value in hidden places. They do all the right stuff, man. I mean, it's a full ecosystem there of just, and I think Coach Stoutland is probably the biggest reason for it.
When did Coach Stoutland go to the Eagles? I mean, was he there with Doug Peterson, and was he there before?
Yeah.
Or
oh yeah, he was there when they drafted Kelsey. So at least, was that 15 years, or whatever. And
so he was there. Was he there with Andy Reid and Chip Kelly?
I think Chip Kelly may have brought him there, actually, because Stoutland was at Alabama, I think, for a year or two before Philly, and I'm pretty sure Chip Kelly brought him there, and they drafted Lane Johnson. But I could be wrong, because it was right on kind of that line, though. It's right around there. I'm not sure if Andy Reid had him, though. I don't know that he did.
Yeah. So, like, when I think about the Eagles' offensive line, I think about the pulling center. I mean, Darmonte Dawson, I think, used to pull, but I mean, is that a current trend? I mean, you see the center trap, you see him leading, on, I don't know, maybe a mid-zone play. Like, is that a current trend, pulling the center? Or people copying the Eagles from what you've been seeing and studying?
Not really. I mean, you see the center pull. It depends on who your center is, really, and yeah, that's what it depends on. There's some centers that have done that at a high level, like Mitch Morse is another one, and going back to Casey, he was a Missouri left tackle. transitioned to center as a pro. Him and KC, he was kind of like a Kelsey light. And then he got hurt, and then he went into free agency, and then he signed with Buffalo, and then now he's with the Bills. He's a starting center. He still does some of that, but not as much. There's always like 2 or 3 centers probably that do some of the Kelsey stuff. It's just they don't do it quite like Kelsey. It's just but I don't know that it's necessarily a trend, but it is sprinkled, into different schemes if you have the center to do it.
Yeah. So like Coach McNally, he talks about, not lead stepping, and, the classic thing is, Coach, on the high school level, Coach, the guys aren't coming off the ball. I mean, is the first step overrated? And I mean, is your last step more important, or your next step? Like, what's the trends on that? I mean, are just covering guys up and staying on your block? Coach us up on what's the current trends on that, because people don't play with a flat back anymore.
I would. Sorry, dog barking there. I would say, your first step is incredibly important. It's kind of like how you start is how you finish. And that's typically the case. I would say it starts in your stance, being in a functional stance, balanced stance, so you can maximize efficiency of movement. And then also snap timing is huge. I highlight that, time and time again over the years. If you're the first one moving out of your stance, especially in the NFL where the margin for error is so slim, if you're the first one moving, you are just giving yourself that little tiny bit of margin that can and often is the difference between a win and a loss on a rep. So I would say how you start is the most important thing. And it starts with your stance, how you come out of your stance, and when you come out of your stance in terms of timing that up with the snap. And that, digging deeper into the Eagles as well, that is what kind of where Lane Johnson's mastery starts at right tackle. His ability to time the snap and to be a fraction of a second early consistently with his athletic ability, his play speed is just ridiculous. It's a 10 out of 10. And it starts with how his first step, not just the, where the first step goes and, kind of that, but it's really the timing. So I would say, for defensive line, it starts with your get off, and for offensive line, it starts with your get off as well. So I can't agree with, that more. It really is a huge part of winning reps in the run and the pass game.
So, when you're studying, these college guys, do you put more emphasis on the run game, on the pass game? Is it equally important? How do you evaluate all that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say it's probably even. You look at them both equally. And for me, scouting for the whole NFL as opposed to an individual team, that's how I look at it. Now, granted, if I was scouting for an individual team, I would look at it based on who our coaches were and who our scheme, what our scheme was and things like that. But for me, doing it on a broad general level, I would say it's more even. However, pass protection is more difficult for one, generally. Moving backwards in space at that size is just unnatural. It requires a tremendous amount of skill. So if you have a guy who is a really high level pass protector, let's say all things were even and it came down to pass protection and one guy's pass protection was better than the other, and maybe the other guy's run game was a little better, I'm probably taking the pass protector because that is just harder to find. It's a simple supply and demand thing. There's just not 32 average starting tackles in the NFL at any one time. I've been studying the league for 10 years. There's never been more than I would say 20, 25 average or better tackles at any one time ever. And I don't think there ever will be, so, and a lot, I would say the main reason for that is pass protection. And now the league has adopted so much of the college schemes in terms of RPO, heavy play action, condensed formations to a degree, a lot of motion, a lot of window dressing, a lot of stuff to create hesitancy in the defense and to mitigate elite pass rushers. So I think that has helped tremendously, but it's been kind of out of necessity because there's more talent on the defensive line than there is on the offensive line. We can get into that. I've talked about that at length over the years for why it's really interesting. But defensive line, for my money, since I've been studying the league, is the deepest position group in the NFL, defensive tackle and defensive end. There's just so many dudes on that side of the ball. It's crazy, especially compared to the offensive line. So, and I think that kind of, I don't know where you want to go with that next, but yeah, I kind of lost track of your original question.
But that's interesting to me because, you said there's so much depth on the defensive line. And it's like, is there an overabundance? Could any of those guys go and play offensive line? Because, there's been guys that have made the transition, and the better athletes are always on defense.
Yeah. That's what it boils down to. And, there's better athletes on defense, and defense is more natural. You're moving upfield and forward, that's just innate, it's natural. Also, there's a lot more, there's stats for defense, there's sacks, there's, and as a young person, it's like, do I want to go play defense or do I want to go play offensive line? 9 times out of 10, if you're a 300-pound kid who's really talented, you're going to play defense. For one, it's just more natural. I don't want to say easier, but in a sense, I think it kind of is. And, you're going to get a lot more kind of attention, it's just more flashy, so I think that's part of it. That's what kind of leads young people to the defensive line. And it has kind of a trickle up effect to the rest of, to higher levels of football. So that's part of it. But yeah, it really, pass protection, man, is just, it's so, coaching it, like moving backwards, and trying to mirror a guy who's a better athlete than you. That is the most difficult thing for an offensive lineman, in my opinion, especially in the true drop back game. Like, that's why we don't see a lot of true drop back in the NFL. Kind of back to my other point, there's a lot of RPOs now, a lot of play action, and there's various reasons for that. But I think a big part of it is you're hiding your offensive line. You're allowing them to set aggressive jump set on guys. They're not having to take true drop set or true drop back pass sets, very often. They still have to in high leverage situations, but that's what often separates the great offensive lines from the okay offensive lines and everything else. Is typically you have 1 or 2 tackles who can play on an island, and at any given time in the NFL, there's less than 10 offensive tackles, period, who can play on an island against high level competition, and you could feel good about it. Lane Johnson being one, Trent Williams, being another, Tyron Smith, there's Penei Sewell, Rashawn Slater. There's always like 8 or 10 of those dudes. But if you don't have one of those dudes, man, you're going to have to scheme it up. You're going to have to protect guys in pass protection, just because it's a hard thing to do, man. And not a lot of guys on this earth at that size can do it. So that's kind of what it comes down to, I think.
So as a scout, if you know that in college, the best players are playing on the edge, that the best players are offensive tackles, do the NFL guys have more of a tendency to look to tackles because they may be more athletic, and then they can always move them down into a guard or guards to center? Is that way of thinking correct?
I don't know if it's necessarily correct, but it definitely is the case. And it really comes down to supply and demand. There's just, like I said, there's at any given time, there's just not a lot of good starting tackles. So if there is a really legit good starting tackle in college, you're going to look at him first, because the supply is lower than it is for interior offensive linemen. So naturally, in terms of draft capital, you're going to allocate higher draft capital towards what there's less of a supply of. And then you're going to work your way down from there. And it just makes total sense. If you're a good tackle, you're going in the first round. If you're, maybe you have a second or third round grade as a tackle, you're probably going in the first round. I mean, it's just the way it is. And, you can find starting tackles later in the draft. I mean, we see it, but if you're kind of an obvious, super talented tackle who has good tape, you're going in the first round. The standard to get there as a first round guy, as a guard or center, is just much higher. You have to be a total ass kicker, dominant, no blemishes whatsoever. Whereas tackle, there's a little bit more leeway. And I think it really just comes down to the fact that there's just not a lot of those guys. So if there is one, you got to go get them. You got to spend the draft capital on it. And then, maybe if it doesn't work out, you have that option of going inside. Whereas with a guard, I mean, if it doesn't work out, you're not kicking them into tackle. That's for sure. So, it just, that's how I make sense of it, at least.
I mean, just looking at the AFC and the number of teams that are playing with a backup quarterback or Joe Flacco, who's been out of the game. I mean, and they're winning. I mean, they're in the playoff hunt, but are there a lot of teams who are on their second or third tackle that are winning? Like,
you just named the Browns. They're okay. So Jack Conklin out for the year, right tackle. His backup, DeJuan Jones, out for the year. Left tackle, Jedrick Wills, out for the year. So they got a third string right tackle at this point and a backup left tackle at least right now. And they have at least, like, Jedrick Wills got hurt like 4 or 5 weeks ago. DeJuan Jones just got hurt, but Jack Conklin got hurt at the beginning of the year. So they've had a backup at least the entire period, 95% of the year at one tackle spot. And then the last month and a half, they've had 2 backup tackles. However, this is kind of a unique case because they have Bill Callahan,
and Scott Peters.
And Scott Peters. So I would put Callahan on kind of like the Mount Rushmore of offensive line coaches in the last decade. So he also designs a run game. And they lost their star running back at towards the beginning of the year, Nick Chubb.
Yeah.
And they're still winning games. I think a huge part of that is just Bill Callahan being really good at what he does, designing an effective run game. And then Kevin Stefanski, the coach, obviously he's an offensive guy, utilizing, a good amount of play action and things to just kind of base things around the run game and letting your offensive line be aggressive and not, asking too much of them necessarily. And also they have a really good interior trio, which helps. I think they have one of the 2 best guard tandems in the NFL with Joe Antonio and Wyatt Teller, so at least they've had that to rely on as well. So that's an interesting case, but there are other teams with backup tackles, in and out of the lineups that make it work. And I think that usually comes back to coaching, scheme, and development as well.
Yeah. For the people who, are out there, maybe coach defensive line. I mean, are you looking for guys who can 2-gap and hold people? Or are you looking for people like I watch Ndamukong Suh and Aaron Donald highlights, and they're just like avoiding people and getting in the backfield and just wreaking havoc? I guess what determines? I guess it's the coaches or the scheme that determines what you want, or what do you prefer? A guy that can take somebody on, or a guy who avoids? And is there a trend in that?
I think from a scout's perspective, it all depends on who your coaching staff is and what your scheme is. That's what you're going to be looking for, players to fit what they're being asked to do. If you're playing, a 3-man front, odd front, and, which is kind of like a Vic Fangio type of scheme, a lot of 3-man fronts with a lot of coverage, behind it. Obviously, those guys need to take on 2 gaps, and be more stout against the run first and foremost. But, if you're playing a scheme like, Jim Schwartz in Cleveland, where they have 2 wide 9s and then, at least 1 or if not 2, 3 techniques on the field at any given time, obviously that's different. I think as a scout, as long as you know what you're looking at and describe it properly, then that's for the decision makers to decide what fits their scheme best. But if I'm watching a great 2-gapper, I'm going to say, man, this guy's a great 2-gapper, but hey, on third down, probably get him off the field. That's, most great 2-gappers are going to have to come off the field on third down. As long as you articulate that and let it be known in the report, then, in terms of valuing that, those guys aren't as valuable as guys who can rush the passer, I don't think. But again, it kind of depends on your scheme. And yeah, I would come back to that. But give me the elite pass rusher over the elite run defender, pretty much every time, just because I think those are more rare. But man, I love a good elite, nose tackle as much as anybody. Trust me. So.
Yeah. So what would a typical report look like? How long are those things?
Yeah, I mean, people can check them out. I have this is my 4th year at Bleacher Report doing reports. So watching every eligible offensive lineman in the draft. So the last 3 draft classes, I have every single guy written up. You could just type in the player's name in Google and then my name. And then just find the Bleacher Report link. So literally hundreds of reports are out there. You can read them, so that's one way. But I would say in terms of length, I just kind of do it basic, following what Bleacher Report wants, of course, as well. This isn't maybe, how I would necessarily design it, but I do like the way they do it. And it's basically strengths, 6 or 7, sometimes 4 or 5 or so, at least 4 or 5 strengths, and then weaknesses, and then notes in terms of anything pertinent to, injury history, background, were they a wrestler, track, field, whatever, anything, unique to them, stats, accolades, that kind of stuff. And then a summary, and then the summary, I typically like to say how long they've been starting, how many games they've been starting. I always like to list the run pass splits of the offense that they're playing within. So, 55-45 run pass split, play action based, outside zone scheme with some gaps sprinkled in. Started 40 games over 3 years at left guard, 6 at left tackle, whatever, and just kind of outline that right away. And then you go through how they are as a run blocker, as a pass blocker. And then the last paragraph for me, 2-3 lines, is basically, you're trying to cut this player down to 2 or 3 lines and make it concise and descriptive. And then that's how I like to end the report. So if anything, you could skip everything I wrote and just go down to that last paragraph and you get a snapshot of who that guy is if you don't want all the details. So that's how I like to write reports. And it kind of, I think addresses how everybody likes it. I know some coaches want to read the details. Some GMs or scouts or, personnel directors, whatever, they just want the last line, that kind of tells me what I'm getting. So yeah, I try and appease both sides, and that's how I do mine.
Anybody in the last 3 years that you were right on and maybe the NFL took late or, didn't think was going to be as good, or maybe went undrafted to being a starter that you can think of?
Yeah, undrafted. There was like one guy that comes to mind, just Will Fries, the Colts right guard from Penn State. He got drafted in the 7th round. I gave him a 5th round grade, so not like that much different, but I definitely saw a path there, for him to become a starter. That's one. He's broke out this year. I think this is his 3rd year. He's kind of came out of nowhere to most people, but he's always a guy that stood out to me. Man,
why did he stand out? What was
Will Fries? So yeah. So I think with him, the thing that stood out to me was his ability to finish blocks was impressive. And that was a function, I think, of good leverage. I kind of look at run blocking like there's a first, second, and third phase. So first phase is how you get into your fit. Second phase is, how you create displacement. And then third phase is how you sustain that block and finish that block when the guy late in the down, when the guy's trying to disengage. And that's the most difficult part, is that third phase finish. So he actually had a lot of good tape in that third phase, his ability to sustain, steer, and maintain control late in reps. And that was just his ability to manipulate leverage, play with good body positioning, good grip strength, and a great effort, as a finisher. All those things I think were flashed, many times over his college career and over his tape. Wasn't the biggest, strongest, or most powerful guy, but he was sticky, as a run blocker. When he got into a guy, it was kind of rare to see a defender able to slip him quickly. And that was because he was really good with his technique. So that was a guy who, I liked, as kind of an early day 3 guy as opposed to a late day 3 guy. He doesn't have the physical traits that you ideally want for like a high level starter, but I saw a guy who could be like a solid starter, for a while in the NFL. So it's cool to see him, look like he's on that trajectory. But yeah, it's interesting. There's kind of, not to go on a tangent, but one of my pet peeves is like, when fans especially, look at football players in the NFL and college or wherever, and they always say like, this guy's great or he sucks, right? And there's no middle ground, and I think that's one of the biggest oversights of like, a lot of maybe analysts too, is like, I was taught through the scouting academy to look at the NFL on a bell curve. So and we were taught a 1 to 7 grading scale. So 7 being elite, 1 being poor. There's very few of those guys. So 1 and 7, they're on the opposite
And
ends.
who is that from? Is that from Bill Walsh or Bill Parcells?
The 1 to 7, I think, is a Parcells. I think the lineage is back to Parcells. He may have been 1 to 9 or 1 to 7. I can't remember what he was, but ours definitely came from that tree, I think. But yeah, anyway, 1 to 7, I still use.
And what is 7? 7 is a Hall of Fame.
7 is elite. So yeah, 7 is elite, 1 is poor. So, and you can categorize players like this, but we more so categorize traits like this. So we were taught to look at 5 critical factor traits and 5 position specific traits for every position. So 10 total, and you grade each of those on a 1 to 7 scale. But my point was like 1 to 7, you don't see that a lot. Like that's very, very rare. However, that's how most people talk about players. They're a 1 or they're 7. That's just not the case. 80% of the NFL is a 4 on that scale, which is average or solid, or some, they're on the fence of a 3 to 5, basically is where 80% of the NFL resides. Below average, average, above average. And those are kind of where that's the meat of the roster. That's, 80% of your roster is a 3 to a 5, typically. And then, man, if you can accumulate a few 6 and 7s, awesome. Then you're probably gonna have a really good team. So yeah, we can go through that.
I was just thinking about this though, like someone keeps the analytics or someone, I don't know if I guess it's opinion based, or you take all the scouts' opinions and put it in a computer, and these guys in the NFL, they know where a team's talent is supposed to be. And if the talent doesn't match the record, then I guess that's a problem. Or are there teams that don't have as high of a rating when you combine them all that win? Do you understand what I'm asking, like, or stating?
Yeah, it's never just black and white. Like, you have higher numbers, you're going to win more. I think the coaching is a huge part of this. What positions are these players being put in? That's something that is a very interesting kind of, I guess, quote unquote trend that I've seen over the last 8, 9, 10 years. Really, is an offensive lineman goes to one place and he's a high pick, first, second, third round, whatever, and he quote unquote stinks, right? But when you watch the film, there's flashes of what he did in college, but however, he's not consistent. All right, this guy stinks. Okay, all right, so now his first contract's up, he's going to a new team, new system, new coach, and now all of a sudden this player is good. Now what happened? I'm sure he developed, on his own and worked hard and things like that. I'm not, discounting that, but what he was being asked to do changed. Therefore, the production of the player changed. So that happens almost every single year for offensive linemen. I could give you a few examples of that. But that's one that, so it's not just as cut and dry as like, rating these traits and, putting a grade on a player and that's how he's going to do or not do in the NFL. It really, situation is huge. The environment is huge. Coaching, what he's exposed to. Sometimes a simple cue for a player a different coaching cue can unlock that player versus a coach who can't give that cue to that player. He can't, unlock that. And then the player just consistently, he's stagnant, right? He just struggles. So that's a very interesting topic that is very nuanced, but listening to these players over the years at offensive line masterminds, I've heard so many stories of their confidence level is the reason why they had a good year or not. And a lot of that is based on what they're being told by the coaches and what they're being asked to do. And once that kind of fits them a little bit better, then all of a sudden they're maximizing who they are as a player. And it happens every year.
Okay, so what you just said, the O-line masterminds, you to hear the players talk. And I hear all these NFL guys have told me that they learn more from the players than maybe the players learn from them. So what traits do these coaches have that can get the most out of their players? I mean, is it the relationship they build? Is it that they remind them of a previous coach? Like, what do they say?
Yeah. I mean, it really is. I don't know if there's a general answer to that. I think it's a case by case thing. If I try to generalize it, I would say having an open mind would be the first step, and that's, it's simple, but I think that's probably the first and foremost thing is just having an open mind to maybe, tinkering, altering with the way that you believe things are supposed to be done, to maybe incorporating something new into the fold and, trying to adapt that to the player. I would say that would be maybe, one, avenue to do that, to get the most out of your players. And I definitely think, as with any career field, if you're leading people, the better relationship you have with them, chances are, the performance that you're going to get out of them is better as well. So yeah, developing the relationship is huge. So you can, relate to them and speak to them where they're actually hearing you and listening and things like that. So yeah, relationship building is huge. But from a coaching perspective, like technically speaking, I would say the open mind, and just, going to clinics, going to different things outside your comfort zone, trying to just diversify, your coaching practices and your techniques and things like that, will increase your chances of maximizing different sorts of players.
When we say current trends in offensive line play, like what's the first thing that pops into your mind, or the first couple things maybe that we haven't spoke about?
I mean, we've touched on the big ones in terms of the scheme changes over the years, looking more like college, in the pro game, in terms of like, really RPO is a big one, for sure, which helps the quarterback as well as the offensive line in a lot of ways. I would say that would be one. I wanted to touch on offensive linemen turning their career around, based on going to a different situation, different coaching staff. That's definitely a yearly trend. Any other ones, I'm not too, I guess we could say there's more gap offenses, more gap principles being incorporated, especially into what we traditionally think of as zone offensive schemes. Kyle Shanahan being one. Over the last few years, he's incorporated more gap principles into his schemes. It's not just pure zone anymore. Like, that's not who Kyle Shanahan is anymore. That's still kind of the foundation, but you're going to see him run power. You're going to see him run GT counter. You're going to see him run, maybe you might see a trap in there once in a while. I mean, you're going to see some stuff like that. So more multiple run schemes, as opposed to this is a heavy zone, this is a heavy gap. I've seen that more so over the last few years, maybe even longer, 5, 6, 7 years. There used to be more like schemes that were majoring heavily in one of those areas. Now I would say it's more multiple than ever. You still do have some zone based, primarily, like Atlanta, jumps to mind. They're heavy zone, not a lot of other stuff in there, but by and large, man, I mean, I just think it's more multiple. And I think part of that is because just how we've seen football change. Guys are getting lighter, faster. So how do we kind of flip that on its head? Let's get bigger and heavier in the run game. Let's go downhill at you, vertical duo. I mean, we're seeing duo, light up the NFL right now in a lot of ways. Look at the Rams. Sean McVay, when he came into the league in 2017, heavy zone. Now, heavy duo, right? That's what they do. So he's totally adapted his scheme completely, in terms of run game. So still a lot of the McVay stuff on there in terms of motion and how he manipulates linebackers, but he does duo now a lot. So I would say it's, kind of becoming more of a vertical downhill game in some ways, but I would say more multiple than anything, which is kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, we got a question here. This is from Coach Bald. He wants to know, why is Bob Wiley not coaching the NFL? I guess there's only 32 of those jobs in the whole universe.
Yeah, I wish I had an answer. I don't know. Never got the pleasure of speaking with Coach Wiley before, but I've seen, all the stuff that, everyone else has seen in terms of some of his clips and stuff. But yeah, I don't know. Does he want to coach and he's not coaching? I'm not sure. Is that the case?
I'm not sure. We did a 5-hour podcast with him one Saturday.
Oh, that's awesome.
He was the best. It's the longest offensive line podcast of all time.
I got to check that out.
The offensive line coach in West Florida, and Bob Wiley. Coach Jim McNally cussed me out during that podcast. Yeah, because we got Coach Dick LeBeau to do a message for Coach McNally, and he did not like that because he said that Dick LeBeau schmoozed him, and
really?
He felt like we should not have done that without his permission first. So that was pretty fun.
I gotta go back and check that episode out.
Oh man, yeah. I have the part with Coach McNally just cussing me out. I posted it on YouTube just so people can watch it and laugh. Yeah. So awesome. How did you meet Bill Best?
He just basically Twitter, just reached out to me because I post videos all the time of techniques I see and things that stand out with the offensive line world. And I've had a lot of coaches over the years, which is one of the coolest things ever, say that all my stuff, they make their players follow me and just watch my stuff.
Man,
all I'm doing is just posting the best of the best in the NFL, essentially. And another thing that I've done is I've built a library over the years of teach tape. So, and I've been able to help out coaching staffs with that over the years as well, which has been very cool. So I have a lot of teach tape, man. I have about close to 1,000 reps right now of teach tape, just offensive and defensive line techniques, about 40 techniques, about 1,000 clips. So I'm building that every year, so who knows how big that'll get, but yeah, so that's another thing I do.
So basically players and coaches, high school, college, can just go to your Twitter and scroll through and keep up with the latest trends in offensive line play.
Yep. Yeah, they could do that. Twitter, Instagram, same handle, Brandon Thorn NFL. Yep. I post, that's what I do is I just post videos there primarily. And then my Substack, if you want to go more in depth, I've built a lot of stuff over there, like in-depth articles, in-depth film rooms. There's probably 36 current NFL players that I've done film rooms with, high-level All-Pro, Pro Bowl guys, down to more solid average guys. So there's that. I have coaches on there. I just did a film room this week with Mark Schlereth on the cut block.
Wow.
So we did the art of the cut block with Mark Schlereth. So that's 45 minutes, me and him just diving into the cut block, the nuances of it. We talked a lot about Alex Gibbs. I mean, it was cool. So stuff like that's on my Substack for anybody who's interested as well.
Man, it's awesome. Is there anything else that you wanted to say before we sign off?
I don't think so, man. Just thanks for having me. This was fun.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I'm going to press end right here and we just chat for a little bit,
sure.
Brandon, but I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, my pleasure, man.
Thank you, buddy.
Yep.